So, in a rather kind of interesting connection, the Cold War, this fight against the communists, is actually going to have an impact on fighting for civil rights because the Soviet Union, the communists, were using race problems in the United States against the United States, arguing that all of the racial riots in the 1920s and all the lynchings that were going on even in the 1950s were an argument that showed just how bad American-style capitalism could be. And we're going to see that this is going to be something that is going to be used against people striving for civil rights all the way up through Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. This idea that people that wanted civil rights must have been communists. It's important to note, too, that there are two different styles of segregation that we're going to see in the United States. The first is referred to as de jure segregation, and this means by law. So de jure segregation is if there's a specific rule, like in South Carolina, there was a law that said that a black person cannot marry a white person. That's referred to as a miscegenation law. That is a de jure practice. That's where you see the white and colored signs outside of like a white water fountain. In comparison to de jure, there is what's referred to as de facto, or segregation by practice. And this is what was more common up in the North. This is where we can see, like, say, in a modern housing development. People know that some places are mixed racial housing developments, and then you have gated communities where almost the entire population is white. There's no real rule that says that, but in practice, because of the way economics and generational wealth work out, it's kind of how it works. And we can see this is a problem with modern school segregation in the 2020s. De facto segregation. There's no law that says that there needs to be separate facilities, and yet there are certain school districts that are very white and school districts that are very multiracial. Now, Eisenhower in the 1950s is going to want to avoid racial conversations. He had a couple of reasons why he wanted to do this. He thought that it would raise temperatures on the issues. He thought that he wanted the majority of government to occur at the state and local level, and it wasn't really his place. And that means that when people were talking about states' rights, that was often the right to have these segregation laws. He also believed that by talking about the issues, it just make them worse. So he didn't want to upset white voters by talking about racial conversations, and that means that the civil rights activists are going to be the ones that are going to have to force him to do so. And in 1954, the NAACP sponsored sponsored legal arguments that's going to lead to Brown versus the Board of Education. Now, this is a court case that argued that separate school facilities were inherently unequal. Now, remember, Plessy versus Ferguson said that it was okay to have separate but equal facilities. Now, what Thurgood Marshall is going to argue to the Earl Warren-led Supreme Court is that in Brown versus Board of Education, he says that separate facilities are inherently unequal, that simply the act of separating the races out is going to make the black students feel inferior, and for that reason, they are unequal even if they were exactly the same, which they weren't. So, Brown versus the Board of Education says that schools need to integrate with all deliberate speed. All deliberate speed, which means when they feel ready, they should integrate. Eisenhower, for his part, refused to endorse this decision. He also refused to acknowledge or condemn the racial violence, the lynching of Emmett Till. And we're going to talk about all this more just momentarily.